Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Katherine Carman, who is a senior economist at the RAND Corporation, director of RAND's Center for Financial and Economic Decision-Making, and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. Her research focuses on behavioral economics, health economics, and public economics. She is particularly interested in how individuals' beliefs, perceptions, and decision-making processes affect their choices. Katie Carman, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here today.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Katie, will cover your recent co-authored report called Individual Differences in Resistance to Truth Decay, which has a subtitle, Exploring the Role of Reasoning and Cognitive Biases. And we will have a link to this report in the show notes. Before we get into this particular report, however, could we start by getting your assessment of the information and cognitive challenges facing global societies today?
These are tough times. There are so many reasons why these are tough times. At a big picture level, we have pandemic, war, inflation, climate change, political polarization. In our own personal lives, we have a pandemic, inflation, financial insecurity, individual burnout, and we have information coming at us from a million different channels. And it's hard to know what we can trust. It's hard to filter out the noise. And this is really cognitively demanding. It's constant. And it's hard for our brains to know what to do with all that information and to know how to decide what's good information and what's bad information. That is a massive challenge for us in basically everything we do.
The report that we're going to be talking about here, I believe it is part of a larger project at RAND, isn't it? It's RAND's Truth Decay initiative. Do you think you could talk just a little bit about this initiative? What is Truth Decay and why is it important to study this?
Yes. So RAND has been studying truth decay for 5 years. The idea is that the line between fact and fiction in American public life has been blurred. There are 4 key trends that we talk about. First of all, we disagree about facts and data. As an example, this morning on NPR, I heard a discussion. The journalist said a fact, a verifiable fact. And the person being interviewed said, "You're framing about that fact." And I thought, that's a fact. There's no framing. It is or it isn't. And that makes things really difficult when we don't agree about what is a fact and what is not a fact, what is true and what is not true. And people aren't very good at telling what is a fact and what is an opinion. And because of that, there's a blurring between the line between opinions and facts. That's the second key trend that we talk about. In the media, it's really unclear when you're looking at a newspaper or you're watching cable news or you're looking at social media. What's an opinion and what's news? What is factual news and what's someone's commentary or take on that? The third trend is that opinions and personal experience are gaining influence over facts. So the amount of information that is coming out that is opinion or personal experience, instead of big, broad facts, is much larger percentage of the news than it used to be. News, when you saw it on television when I was a child, more years ago than I'm willing to admit, was news. Now, when you turn on any of the cable news networks, large chunks of time are devoted to opinion and commentary. And the fourth trend is that there's a declining trust in respected sources of information. And this has 4 big causes. 1, the information environment is changing. Two, our society is more polarized. Three, there are competing demands on our education system that make it hard for education to provide us with the skills that we need to identify facts. And the fourth, and the one that is most close to my interests, is about the fact that our cognitive processes, the way that our brains work, make it hard for us to deal with information. So why is this important? There are so many decisions that we as a society need to be able to make to be informed. And those decisions need to be informed by facts. If we can't agree on facts, how can we come to any reasonable decisions? How can we make the best decisions for our society? And I think this really touches on everything. This touches on the decisions we need to make about our economy, climate change, the pandemic, immigration, inequality, whether we have a functioning democracy. All of those things require us to agree on something, but we can't even agree on basic facts. And so I think that this is a problem that simmers underneath everything that we do. So this is something we've been working on, as I said, for 5 years. We've done work on trust in institutions, work on civic education, education in media literacy, research on how the news presents information, research on voting. I'm missing so many things.
Right. Yeah. And I know you could just keep on pulling the string on this and just go on for quite some time. I'm reminded when you were just giving your response there, Katie, of a previous episode, actually two previous episodes, one with a gentleman named Yuval Levin, who has done a lot of interesting work on institutions and what institutions are, what the purpose of institutions are, and the erosion of trust in our institutions. And you touched upon probably a half a dozen just as you were responding just a moment ago, from education to news to our political institutions to I think you mentioned healthcare or the pandemic. I mean, all of those have institutional structures that are part of those topics. And truth decay and the inability to agree upon facts, as you were saying, goes right to the heart of some of those challenges. Would you say that that's fair?
I think so. I think the pandemic is a good example. In the case of a pandemic, we need an organization like the CDC to be able to provide us with information. And we need to be able to trust that information so that we as individual citizens can make decisions about what we should do. But if we don't trust those organizations, how are we going to fight these problems? I think that's really a huge challenge that our society faces.
The other podcast that came to mind was a more recent one that we did with a lady named Vanessa Otero, and she is the CEO of the organization that produces that media bias chart. You've probably seen it before, but it's like a graph that has, basically like right and left as far as progressive or conservative, just very broadly speaking. But anyway, but we talked about the health of the news ecosystem, and I don't want to like jump to solutions, but one of the things that we mentioned was like, wouldn't it be nice, and lots of hand waving here, but wouldn't it be nice if there was some kind of a way in close to real time to be able to somehow identify like news or broadcasts which are opinion versus fact. And just like something that's like up in the corner of the screen that says kind of like cigarette labels, right? Those big labels that say, if you consume this product, your chance of cancer goes up tremendously, or consuming cigarettes is bad for your health. But something like says, this is an opinion broadcast, so just be mindful of that as you're consuming this information.
I think that that's really important. I think that there needs to be a balance between people having the skills to identify facts versus opinions, true facts versus not true facts, and us setting up the institutions and the way that information is provided to people in a way that helps them to do that. All of the burden shouldn't be on individuals to figure everything out for themselves. Having like you said, a warning label or something would be really helpful, because we can't always tell.
Right. And I recognize, to our audience, I recognize that this is a slippery slope, or well, then who is the arbiter of these things, and how do you algorithmically assign these labels, and who's in charge of the algorithm, what was used to train the algorithm, and you can start, as we said a moment ago, just like pulling that string all the way back to some foundational analysis, which not everybody agrees with. So anyway, there's lots of hand waving here. It's not an easy problem, but it does seem like our human brains need just a little bit more guidance in order to help interpret what's coming at us, or something like that.
Our human brains definitely need guidance. Our human brains take shortcuts all the time. That's part of what makes it possible for us to survive in the world, is that we take shortcuts in our brains to deal with the overflow of information and all of the things that are happening. And so we should be realistic about what humans can do. I will say, it doesn't have to come from someone else, some regulating authority telling the news media what they have to do about how they present information. Opinion pieces in the newspaper used to be limited to the op-ed page. That wasn't regulated. That's how newspapers did things.
Right.
And that comes from their own choice about how they operate. And over time, the way that they choose to present information has changed. That doesn't have to be regulation. That can be decisions made by individual organizations that they will label things as opinion or not.
Yeah, well, you're describing a norm, I guess, that emerged or somehow evolved within the newspaper industry, that you've got news on all these pages, and these pages are editorials, these are opinions, and they were labeled as such. But when people turn on cable news, or they have all kinds of access to all kinds of other information channels these days, that kind of differentiator is typically absent. So people don't know whether what's coming at them is intended to just be factual, or whether it's opinion.
Yes, definitely.
Interesting. Well, this starts, I think, getting into your expertise. And so, as we mentioned, you're an economist with a particular interest in human decision making. And so we've already started talking about this a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about how Truth Decay integrates into your areas of interest?
Yeah. So how does an economist end up doing research on Truth Decay, I think is a really good question. I'd summarize economics as the study of choice under constraint. Usually that constraint is that we have limited financial resources and we have to make choices with limited financial resources. But we also have limited information and we have limited cognitive resources. And I've always been really interested in the perception and use of information and how that affects the choices that we make. When Rand started working in this area, this Truth Decay area, I was just really excited to get involved, because I'm fundamentally really interested in how information affects our choices. And if the information that we have is less true, then that's potentially going to lead us away from making good choices. Choices that are the best choices for us individually, and choices that are the best choices for our society. So to me, it was a natural progression.
Very cool. Maybe we can start getting a little bit more into the report. And so something that struck me, and I'd love to hear your comments on this, but this report, you guys really had an interdisciplinary team assembled. It looks like there's a behavioral decision theorist, an anthropologist, a political scientist. I'm curious if you've noticed over the past few years any kind of increase in interdisciplinary studies, and if yes, then why do you think this is?
So this report was so fun. It was so fun because bringing together all those people with those different points of view was exciting every step of the way. I like to call it an economist, a political scientist, a psychologist, and an anthropologist walked into a bar paper.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like the setup of a joke that you would put all of those people together in one room and ask them to think about a problem. But we wanted to think about cognitive biases and how they really impact how people perceive facts and information in our society. And to do that, we needed to learn from each other. But doing that kind of interdisciplinary work is really hard. We didn't always see eye to eye. We didn't agree on everything we did. And that was hard. And that is exactly what made our work better, because we challenged each other and we pushed each other. When we came up against disagreements, that's where we broke through and came up with new ideas. And so I think that was what made it really, really fun. I think this kind of work can have big payoffs in terms of answering big questions. And I think that researchers and the people who fund research do know that interdisciplinary work can have these payoffs. So I see it slowly increasing, but often what you have is different groups working in parallel. And it's rare to find teams that really dig into a problem together. That takes work. That many people aren't willing to engage in that kind of hard work, and the individual payoff isn't always there. My economist friends and journal editors don't always understand what I'm doing working with an anthropologist or a psychologist. But these big problems take effort, and no one discipline is going to solve them.
Well, this has all been a great prelude, Katie. Maybe we can get into the report itself. So what were you and your colleagues hoping to add to the Truth Decay discussion?
We had a couple of goals. First, we had originally hypothesized that one of the drivers of truth decay was that cognitive biases contribute to truth decay. So we really wanted to dig into that. We wanted to know how that happens. How do cognitive biases contribute to truth decay? What biases, and how can we measure that? Second, we needed to come up with a way of measuring whether people were susceptible to truth decay. We had this big societal trend, but we had no way of knowing who are the people who are the most susceptible to these problems. Because you can't solve a problem unless you actually know what the problem is. So we developed a measure that includes a bunch of different factors that are related to this problem. Oh, and we also wanted to know, are you more likely to die of shark attacks or lightning strikes?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that begs the next question. What's the answer to that?
Lightning strikes. Way by far, lightning strikes. But I think that was a really important question for us to ask, because we asked that in our survey, because we wanted to know how people think about the risks that they face in their life. Do they think that things are common because they hear about them a lot in the news, or do they know what's really common? We hear about shark attacks a lot more than we hear about lightning strikes. You hear about a shark attack every time it happens, but lightning strikes happen something like 1,000 times more often than shark attacks.
I see. And so I think this starts getting into a really important topic of bias. I'd love to understand that just a little bit better. There's probably a bias label that you can put on this dynamic that you were just describing, but Could you unpack bias just a little bit more for us in order to help us understand your findings?
Sure. That one is called availability bias, just so you know. But I'll tell you, cognitive biases can be defined as the way in which a person's beliefs, attitudes, reasoning, or decisions can deviate from reality or strict rationality as a result of patterns and tendencies in human processing. Or it's the systematic and predictable errors that result from highly economical and usually efficient heuristic reasonings. That last definition comes from Kahneman and Tversky, who are like the godfathers of behavioral science. So it's the way our brain takes shortcuts. It's the simple things our brains do to help us make decisions. And there are hundreds of biases that people have in all the things that we do in our lives. So we wanted to figure out what were the biases that were most related to truth decay, and try to figure out how those might relate to whether or not someone is susceptible to truth decay. We also considered some things which we'll call cognitive operations. Just another way to say that is how your brain reasoning processes, or the way that you actually think. So that includes like numeracy and whether you have background in scientific thinking. We also looked at magical reasoning, which is like, are you susceptible to superstition? All of these are things that might influence how susceptible you are to truth decay.
Would you say that a lot of the ways people are influenced maps back to clever ways of hacking these biases?
I think that's fair. So, one of the biases we were really interested in was in-group bias. And this is the idea that you feel more of a connection towards your own cultural group that could be defined by language or religion or nationality or race. And you tend to prefer those people. Well, maybe that doesn't make so much sense today, but if you were to go back thousands of years, you needed to stick with your tribe for safety. You needed to stick with your tribe. And so this could have a biological background. Today, we don't need that in the same way, but our brains are still wired to have this kind of in-group bias. That's one of the hypotheses for why we have in-group bias. We also considered the one I talked about, availability bias. Do you use the information that's available in your brain instead of what might be more true? But if typically what's available, what your brain can find quickly, is the right information, but not always. And if that's something where you could really easily be tricked, right? Like, I want people to be afraid of sharks, so I'm going to have Shark Week and talk about shark attacks in the news all the time, and now people will be afraid of sharks. And we can change what people think and what people are worried about pretty easily. The other thing I want to say, which I think is really cool about this project, is that we were actually really careful about our own biases in this project. There are literally hundreds of biases that people have, and we were trying to figure out which ones we should consider. So we started down this road trying to decide what we should look at, and we were all coming up with some ideas and pulling things out of our heads and saying, I think we should look at this. But I kept saying, I don't think this is very systematic. So we actually took a list of every single cognitive bias we could find, and we rated them to decide which ones we thought were most likely to be related to truth decay. So we took this very systematic process in an attempt to avoid our own biases in determining what to look at, which I think is something that goes back to your question about interdisciplinary work. Because we had all these people coming together, we took a really systematic approach to it. We tried to all learn from each other, and we all rated these different biases. But I thought that was a really cool thing that we did, because we really wanted to avoid what we thought was the right way to approach the problem.
Well, I'd love to know, Katie, so what were some of your key findings that you could pass along to our audience?
So we really thought that the biases would be the most important thing in terms of determining whether or not people were susceptible to truth decay. But we actually found that it was the reasoning processes. Like, are you aware? Are you more numerate? Do you have greater scientific reasoning and less magical reasoning, less thinking about superstitious ideas? Those things were more associated with resistance to truth decay. And things like availability bias and unjustified confidence, which we thought might be related to truth decay, were not. And that actually surprised us. That was not what we were expecting. So there's one that happens. And the other thing was that there were differences within our society about who is more susceptible to truth decay. And that also, I think, is important. We found that that some groups, depending on race and partisanship and religiosity, were more susceptible to truth decay than others. And so I think that suggests that there are groups where we need to think about more about how we can help to protect people, either to give them greater skills or to provide better institutional solutions to help people avoid truth decay. We also learned some weird random facts. Despite what I told you, that lightning is much more likely than death by shark attack. A third of people think they're more likely to die by shark attack. And while most people believe that Tupac and Elvis are dead, they are not so sure about whether or not JFK's assassination was part of a conspiracy. These were questions that we were asking because we were trying to figure out how susceptible people were to truth decay. Did they believe conspiracy theories? That was one of our big measures that we were looking at.
I see. So some controversial findings potentially there. What's been the reaction to, especially that second finding you mentioned, as far as some differences between discrete groups by race and religion and et cetera? What's been the reaction to that?
I think it's difficult. It's a difficult situation. And I think it speaks to the importance of the trends that are underlying truth decay, the partisanship that we're seeing and the polarization that we're seeing in our society, and the fact that it becomes easier to drive our society apart. Yeah, it's troubling, but I think that it also speaks to the importance of finding solutions.
Yeah, for sure. What recommendations do you guys have coming out of this report? And maybe related, what's next for the Truth Decay initiative?
So the next things that are happening now are really working on developing different solutions to this problem. it's really a big problem, as we talked about at the beginning. It permeates across our society, and we need to find solutions. And as I said, I think we need to find solutions that not only improve people's abilities to identify facts and data and use facts and data, but we also have to change the environment in ways that work for people. Given the cognitive processes and the level of knowledge and information that people have, we need the world to work in a way that works for people, not against people. And so those solutions are both going to be targeting how do we, make people better at making decisions, but also how do we, or make people better at understanding the information, but also how do we find things like labeling news articles or using technology to label information that's available on social media. I know that there's a lot of pushback on that, but it may be that that's the best solution is some kind of information, labeling of information.
I see. I probably should have asked this earlier than I'm asking it now. Did your study focus on U.S. populations only, number
Yes.
one? And okay, yes. But do you think that your findings are generalizable, or some of your findings are generalizable outside of the U.S. into other Western societies?
I think that these cognitive processes are not so specific to any particular culture, and so I do think that those things would generalize. We would probably have to do the study in a different way, because we asked questions about Elvis and the JFK assassination, which wouldn't mean something to people in other countries. So we'd have to do something different to do the same study in another country. But I think that the general structure would work elsewhere, and I suspect we'd find similar findings.
Yeah. Well, fascinating work and important work that you and your colleagues are doing there, Katie, at RAND. I'd like to start wrapping up, if I may. So we have a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a fruitful research question that's related to the kinds of things that we've been discussing that an interested student or someone might take a crack at?
I mean, I think that the big question is, how do we solve this problem? And I think that the solution that I really would love to see creative people, especially young minds, thinking about is experimenting with new ideas to help people use information better. Can you come up with a different way of presenting information that will make it easier for people to identify facts?
Yeah. I think that's a good one for sure. Lastly, could you offer a good book or maybe another online resource that our audience might check out if they want a deeper dive into some of these topics? And again, we'll have a link to the paper and to RAND's Truth Decay initiative. So something other than that somebody could check out.
Well, first, if you want to learn more about cognitive biases and processes, I recommend Thinking Fast and Slow. That's a great book for learning about those processes. One of my colleagues recommended a book called Meme Wars, which I haven't read, but I was asking some of the other people who've been working in the Truth Decay area. And I know you said you'd link to the Truth Decay website, but I'll also note that all of our work is available on RAND's website for free. So that is that is particularly good for people who want to get an opening to Truth Decay or to the cognitive bias work, because you can download the PDFs for free.
All right. Katie Carman, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.